Princess Anne did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. With Camilla waiting just meters away and Prince William already aware of what was coming, the appeal was put on the table, and the sentence that the Queen feared most was handed down, rejected. The biggest shock came seconds later, when William confirmed that the original decision could not be challenged, reversed, postponed, or discreetly rewritten. Camilla entered the private meeting, believing there was still room to negotiate. She had lodged an appeal against a permanent family ruling that stripped her authority over a collection of protected royal relics linked to Diana, Queen Elizabeth II, and the future Princess of Wales for ceremonial use, a family custody agreement, in plain language. The terms meant that these pieces were no longer controlled by a single senior member of the royal family, but protected through collective approval. This was important because Camilla could no longer request, redirect, approve, or access these pieces privately and alone. What had happened? At one point, Anne felt that the influence had crossed a line. She felt this limit as clearly as anyone else. I knew Camilla. Over the decades, I had understood what dignity means within the monarchy, and I knew how humiliating that loss would be. The Princess Royal believed that the collection carried obligations that could not be relaxed whenever relationships became uncomfortable. His compassion was real. His decision was more difficult. Camilla's appeal changed the mood when she made a request. The Queen Consort requested that at least one piece associated with Diana remain available to her on major royal occasions. Anne stopped reading, closed the folder. According to a documented account of the private evaluation, it was at that moment that his hesitation disappeared, because an exception would reopen the very door that the safeguard was designed to close. William entered after the rejection was communicated, and his calmness made the atmosphere even colder. The prince explained that the safeguard had been constructed in such a way that no individual resource could undo it. Camilla looked directly at him and asked the question that no one else had dared to ask out loud. "Not even the king?" He paused before responding. "Charles," he explained, "could not reverse the agreement alone because the arrangement had been deliberately constructed to take that power away from anyone acting individually." Anne watched Camilla absorb the meaning. The Queen did not argue again. His influence had hit a wall, and William had confirmed that it was permanent. But Anne's refusal was only the visible outcome of a battle that had become deeply personal. And to understand why the future king refused his own father a way out, the loyalties within this family need to be exposed. For Camilla, this was humiliation. For Anne, it was duty. For William, it was something much more personal. The same decision that seemed procedural from outside the palace touched three completely different wounds inside. And that was why compromise had become almost impossible. Each person who entered that private dispute carried memories, loyalties, and resentments that had been brewing long before the appeal was written. Anne refused to treat the matter as a family favor. She believed that custody mattered more than title, because historical and personal relics were not simply ornaments. They carried promises about who would protect them and who would receive them later. The Princess Royal had spent years watching informal understandings breed resentment behind the scenes. Now, I wanted a limit that affection could not discreetly erase. For her, rejecting Camilla was painful, but allowing the uncertainty to continue would be worse. William carried a different weight. The pieces associated with Diana were not abstract symbols for him. They were part of his mother's memory. While the jewels linked to Queen Elizabeth II represented a continuity that he intended to preserve for Catherine, George, Charlotte, and subsequent generations, the Prince of Wales knew that every decision he made would one day be part of the system his children would inherit. This knowledge transformed personal grief into responsibility. Camilla felt the judgment differently. She remained queen in public, but privately, one of the most symbolic areas of the monarchy had been placed beyond her control. For her, the restriction was more than a technical safeguard. It suggested that decades within the royal family had not yet been enough to gain complete trust. That thought cut deeper than losing access to any specific piece, and she carried that humiliation into every conversation that followed. William He was alone before entering the next meeting and forced himself to slow down. Anger would be easy, containment was more difficult. Protecting Diana's legacy meant going directly against her father's wife, and he knew how quickly that conflict could turn vicious. Anne later told him, in a documented account of their private conversation, that Camilla's appeal sounded like a plea for equity, but beneath its softer language was the real goal: to restore discretionary access, that is, the freedom to request or approve protected pieces without the concurrence of the custodial group. William admitted to having expected exactly that. The safeguards therefore contained a finality clause, a rule that once the formal appeal was rejected, the same internal challenge could not be reopened. Anne understood immediately why he had insisted on this. The door hadn't just been closed, it had been locked before anyone tried to force it. Camilla finally sat down with Charles and asked the question she had been avoiding. Could his position as sovereign change the outcome? The king looked at her, then looked at the papers between them and said nothing. At first, she had expected reassurance, anger, or refusal. His silence scared her more, and this silence takes us back to the moment when everything changed, because the crisis didn't start with Anne's rejection. It began during a specific royal occasion when a protected relic appeared exactly where William had been assured it would never appear. Weeks before the appeal, no one was talking about permanent restrictions. Nobody discussed irreversible decisions. Then came a private dinner in Windsor, an unexpected piece of jewelry, and a reaction from William that changed the course of everything. William had once resisted placing every sensitive relic under written controls. The prince believed that family understanding should be sufficient, especially for plays with private emotional meaning. Under the informal arrangement, historically important jewelry could still be requested for major occasions, but items closely linked to a specific branch of the family required prior consultation with the people responsible for protecting them. Anne had warned that such customs depended excessively on goodwill. He had ruled out stricter restrictions for fear of turning the memory into yet another battle within the palace. Then Windsor changed everything. Camilla arrived at a private dinner wearing a sapphire and diamond piece that had already been registered for future use within Diana's direct line, preserved for Charlotte while transfer arrangements were being prepared. The moment William recognized her, their conversation stopped. Catherine noticed the change immediately and asked quietly if he wanted to leave. He refused. The future king would not create a confrontation in front of everyone, but the silence at that table carried more anger than any words could have carried. Camilla defended herself later. He told William that he believed the play had been properly authorized and insisted that he had never intended to disregard an arrangement involving Diana. The queen consort felt hurt when he treated what happened as a breach of trust rather than a simple administrative error. However, his frustration came from something deeper. He had trusted the promise that that particular piece would remain untouched. Now that promise seemed dangerously fragile. Anne took action the next morning. The Princess Royal asked the custodian of the jewels who had authorized the release, and a documented account of that conversation produced the answer William feared. Approval had arrived via an older discretionary route, a previous internal route that still allowed certain senior applications to be approved without the most recent family consultation. Technically, the path remained open. William believed it had already been closed. William took the inventory record to a private room in Windsor and placed it next to Anne. He said verbal promises were no longer enough. She studied the record, drew a firm line under the item number, and responded that the restriction would now be put in writing. That single gesture turned resentment into politics. Camilla learned of the proposed permanent safeguard before the final signatures were added. He immediately turned to Charles and asked him to intervene, before the restriction became impossible to undo. The king agreed to listen to her, but what he did next forced husband, wife, sister, and heir toward the confrontation they had all spent weeks trying to avoid. Camilla this time did not send a message through an assistant. She confronted Anne personally. No secretaries, no ceremonial language to soften the collision. What followed it was a heated discussion, but something more dangerous. Two women speaking with absolute clarity about respect, trust, Diana, and the limit between being queen and having the power to rewrite private family decisions. Camilla entered determined to stop the restriction before it became permanent. He argued that removing his discretion over protected relics created a humiliating division between his public position and his private authority within the family. Discretion in this context meant the ability to request or approve access without each custodian needing to agree first. The queen consort believed that taking away this power would make her appear trustworthy in public but questionable behind palace doors. Anne heard every word, but her position had already hardened. For her, this was no longer about a piece of jewelry. It was about whether the title could replace promises made to protect what others should inherit. Camilla finally said what had been building up under everything. I told Anne I felt punished by a story I could never change. The words fell heavily because both women knew what history meant without needing to explain. The Princess Royal responded that the decision was not about decades-old resentment. It was about Windsor. It was about what had happened when a play linked to Diana turned up without the consultation William believed had been promised. Anne lost some of her calm when Diana's name entered the conversation. He insisted that William should never again discover the use of his mother's personal legacy upon seeing it unexpectedly at a dinner table. Camilla responded by saying that she had never intended to cause this pain. The queen insisted that she believed the use had been properly authorized. Anne responded that intention could not replace protection, since trust had already been shaken. Camilla then revealed that Charles had privately indicated he would support a limited engagement. According to a documented account of an earlier conversation between them, the king had suggested that there might be room to preserve some ceremonial access. Anne didn't give in. She explained that the new structure had been specifically designed to prevent marital influence from displacing collective consent. Collective consent simply meant that multiple designated family custodians needed to agree before protected pieces could be released. Anne then delivered the detail Camilla hadn't expected. William had called for safeguards not only around jewelry linked to Diana, but also around a small group of Elizabeth's personal pieces intended for Catherine and Charlotte. The Queen looked at her. The restriction was greater than she had understood. Camilla moved her chair back and asked the question directly. Was Anne saying she couldn't be trusted? The Princess Royal held his gaze and replied that trust was exactly the reason why the rules needed to exist before another mistake happened. The door opened soon after. William was waiting outside. Anne told him that Camilla wanted Charles to review the matter. The prince barely hesitated. Her response shifted the conflict from hurt feelings to raw authority, because Camilla was about to discover that Anne wasn't the person who had made the decision impossible to undo. William had anticipated the possibility of pressure, compromise, and intervention from the highest level of the family, even before Camilla formally challenged the decision. The prince had not simply asked for protection. He had helped create a system in which emotional persuasion no longer mattered. William had insisted that the disputed relics be moved to a protected family collection. Under this arrangement, no single senior member could simply order the release of a piece. Custodial approval meant that multiple designated family guardians had to agree before anything changed, creating a barrier against private pressure. The future king believed this mattered because items linked to Diana carried personal significance for him. while other protected pieces were being preserved for Catherine, Charlotte, and the generation that followed. Charles understood the logic, but the cost was heavy. He read the final terms twice without speaking. The king was caught between defending Camilla from what she saw as humiliation and recognizing William's right to protect objects directly linked to his mother. This tension cut deeper because he knew that any attempt to force the issue could reopen wounds within the family that had never completely disappeared. William also felt this pressure. He didn't like putting his father in an impossible position, but he believed that an exception would destroy the entire safeguard. If it regained access because Charles intervened, each future restriction could be challenged on influence rather than principle. The prince wanted a boundary strong enough to survive discomfort, anger, and even royal authority. Then came the clause that Camilla hadn't fully understood. A documented account of the custody arrangement showed that restoring her access required unanimous consent, meaning all designated custodians needed to approve the change. Anne and William had already signed the restriction. This meant that neither Charles nor the queen consort could reverse it alone, no matter how strongly either objected. William had also insisted on a second protection. Once an appeal was formally reviewed and rejected, the same request could not be returned in a different label or slightly altered form. This purpose clause was simple in purpose: a decision, a review, a closure. Charles finally put the document aside. I told William I was asking him to accept a painful consequence in the name of peace. The future king replied softly that the peace won by breaking the safeguard would not survive the next contest. The king heard the message clearly. His son was no longer arguing like a hurt child. I was thinking like someone preparing to inherit authority. Charles refused to confront him directly. This decision left Camilla with only one path: the formal appeal that Anne would end up rejecting. The cruelest part of a permanent decision is not the moment it is announced. It's the first ordinary moment after, when everyone around starts to behave as if the argument is already over. Within hours of Anne's rejection, instructions changed, access lists were rewritten, and future ceremonial planning moved forward without Camilla's approval. The queen was not removed from royal life, but a symbolic door closed with disconcerting speed. Palace staff received revised instructions before the end of the day. From that moment on, any requests involving the protected collection would have to go through the designated custodians rather than Camilla's home office. The change mattered because it turned the rejection of a private family discussion into a work rule that employees now had to follow. Catherine was also informed that several pieces intended for future appearances by the Princess of Wales would remain under protected allocation, ending uncertainty over who could approve their use. Camilla felt the consequences almost immediately. He returned to his private quarters and discovered that a ceremonial request he had hoped to review had already been redirected. There was no confrontation, no dramatic announcement, just a process moving forward without her. The queen consort then understood that the appeal had not simply failed on paper. His authority had already disappeared from the chain. Charles found her unusually quiet later. He expected anger, but what he heard was something more painful. Camilla told him the humiliation wasn't about losing jewelry. It was knowing that the people inside the palace now understood. She had asked for the decision to be reversed and had failed. He tried to assure her that private decisions did not define her public role. She reminded him that palaces run on memory. Employees understand who is being consulted. They understand who is not. Anne watched the final stage of the procedure with the same controlled expression she had carried into the appeal meeting. A senior custodian removed Camilla's discretionary authorization from the internal log, the work log that identifies who can approve access to protected parts. Once the input disappeared, the old arrangement could not continue by accident. Later that night, William asked Anne to talk alone, away from Charles and Camilla. The two were faced with a question that neither had wanted to ask. Had they protected the family, or simply created a fracture that the rules could never repair? The decision had survived the appeal. Its emotional toll was just beginning to show. William and Anne found themselves alone, not as future king and princess royal, but as nephew and aunt. For the first time, he admitted the fear beneath his determination, that if he failed to protect the few personal things Diana had left behind, her children might inherit a royal story stripped of its emotional truth. Anne watched him carefully before asking the question that neither of them had said out loud. Did he still believe that permanent deletion was necessary? After seeing what the decision had done to Camilla, the Princess Royal knew that the Queen's humiliation had been real, and she knew that William had also humiliated her. I had a visa. He responded that the matter had stopped being about one person the moment promises began to depend on who had the most influence. I wanted George, Charlotte, and Louis to inherit something more solid than goodwill. I wanted them to know that once a family promise was made, power could not quietly rewrite it. William admitted that the victory did not feel like a victory. Seeing Camilla absorb the final verdict had made him feel cruel, even though he believed the restraint was necessary. He said he was tired of the assumption that defending Diana's memory must mean hatred for his father's wife. I didn't want revenge. I wanted certainty. This difference mattered because revenge ends when anger passes, while protection needs to survive well beyond when emotions change. Anne understood more than she initially admitted. I told William that rejecting the appeal had been painful because I knew Camilla would hear the word no as something deeply personal. The princess had spent the entire process treating the safeguard as a limit, but the Queen experienced it as rejection from her own family. Anne confessed that duty can still hurt people even when the intention behind it is not cruel. Then he gave William the detail that changed his understanding of Charles. According to a documented account of a private conversation, the king had already accepted the finality of the arrangement before Camilla formally appealed. He had never promised his wife that he could reverse the decision. He had only promised that she would be allowed to ask. Due process, in simple terms, meant giving you a fair chance to present your case before the existing rule was applied. William was silent. His father's earlier silence suddenly made sense. Charles had not been weak or indecisive. He had chosen not to personally tell Camilla that the door was closed, allowing the formal process to deliver the answer in his place. The future king realized that his father had been carrying his own burden, between loyalty to his wife and accepting the limit set by his son. William finally asked Anne if she would sign the restriction again, knowing the damage she had caused. She didn't hesitate. Yes. After a long pause, he gave the same answer. This agreement changed everything. What had begun as a fight over Camilla's access has become a statement about the monarchy William hopes to inherit, one where private pressure cannot override inherited responsibility. When Charles gathered the family together for a final private conversation, everyone understood that the argument itself was over. What remained was more difficult. Accepting what the decision said about trust, memory, authority, and the future. Charles spoke first, and this time there was no hesitation. I told Anne that I would not pressure her to reconsider, and I told William that I would not ask him to weaken the safeguards protecting the designated relics. The custody structure would remain exactly as written. Camilla would keep her personal jewelry and her normal ceremonial role, but the historical pieces in dispute and those linked to Diana would remain outside his discretionary authority permanently. The limit was no longer temporary, it was resolved. Camilla absorbed this truth with visible pain. Charles told her that accepting the restriction did not diminish her place at his side, but she knew the emotional toll would not go away simply because the process was over. The Queen understood that continuing to fight would turn a painful restriction into a lasting family war. She had already appealed once. I had already heard Anne's answer, and now the king himself was asking her to live with it rather than defy him again. William spoke to Camilla without anger. I told him that the decision had never been designed to erase his place within the monarchy. It was designed to ensure that certain promises could no longer depend on affection, influence, or changing personal relationships. I knew those words might not comfort her, but I needed her to understand the difference between rejection and protection, and then explained why even a partial exception would have destroyed the principle she defended. I told Camilla that a special concession would have made all safeguards negotiable. The Queen finally recognized the distinction. He didn't say that the decision seemed fair to him. He simply admitted that he understood why Anne had refused to give in. Later, Charles turned to William with one last acknowledgement. He told his son that a future sovereign sometimes needs to make decisions that not even his own family approves of. A sovereign, in simple terms, is the reigning monarch who holds ultimate public responsibility for the crown. Charles didn't approve of all the painful details, but he recognized something new in William: discipline. To accept personal harm when she believes the future will require it. Camilla took her copy of the resource from the table and left without saying anything else. Anne got up first. William followed her. Charles stood next to his wife. At the end of the meeting, they did not share joy but one fact: the decision would be maintained. Anne's rejection had become more than a denouement about Camilla. It marked a shift from private accommodations to fixed boundaries around memory, inheritance, and responsibility. Camilla left injured, but still queen. Anne left bearing the costs of duty. William left knowing that protecting Diana's legacy had forced him to act less like a son and more like the future monarch he was expected to become. The appeal was rejected. The safeguard remained intact. And no authority, not even that of the crown itself, could erase what had been decided. In the end, irreversible was not a threat. That was the verdict.